I just want to say welcome to a joint session or joint committee on Health and Human Services and Judiciary. And before we start, could we just stand for the pledge? And Senator Gannon, can you lead us in the pledge?
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
All right, and we have Senate Bill 1 and the prime sponsor, Senator Carson. Welcome.
Good morning, Madam Chair, and good morning to the members of the Joint Committee. It's a pleasure to see you all this morning. For the record, my name is Sharon Carson, and I have the pleasure of representing Senate District 14, which comprises the towns of Londonderry, Hudson, and Auburn. And I have for your consideration this morning Senate Bill 1, which is relative to the Sununu Youth Services Center. To give you a little bit of background on this, in the last biennium, in the budget, it was determined that the Sununu Center was going to close, and it was given a closure date of March 23rd, 2023. As we went through the biennium, there was a companion bill that dealt with the building of the new facility. Unfortunately, that bill failed in a committee of conference. So now we are stuck with a closure date of this year in March with no solid plans for a replacement. So what I submitted was the final amendment that had been presented to the committee of conference, and to use that as a starting point for deliberations, because we had agreement on most of the pieces of that, but where the sticking point was going to be the size of the facility. The Senate had suggested a facility built for 12 with a surge capacity up to 18, and it was only going to be staffed by 12. Unfortunately, the House did not agree. They felt that that was too big, and that's the reason why it failed. The other thing about this that's a little different is the actual dates. Again, just to remind you all, the closure date is March 23rd, 2023. This pushes out the date to November 1st, 2024. So that should be able to give us enough time to get this rolling and hopefully completed by then. I think at that point, I'm just going to conclude my testimony. I would like to remind you, this bill is going to be fast-tracked because we are up against a hard date. And so this is the reason why we have the joint committee, because we do want to hear from our fellow senators from the Health and Human Services Committee and get their input on this as well. And I'm hoping that we are going to have this on the floor for our first session day of January 19th. So thank you all for being here this morning. I really appreciate it. And I really appreciate your attention to what really is an extremely important issue for the state of New Hampshire, and hopefully we can move forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator. Any questions from the committee?
Hello.
Senator Avard.
Thank you for your testimony. I was just curious, where is this going to be located, and how do we get with the location?
Thank you for the question. From my understanding, there is a possibility of 3 different locations right now. One is in Manchester, on the existing property that the current Sununu Center is located. The other would be someplace in Concord, and I don't want to give my opinion on where that would be. And the last place would be in Hampstead. But that is the decision of the governor and the council as to where that's going to go. So, but that's my understanding where the 3 locations that they're looking at.
I do have a question, and I'm not sure you can answer this or
Sure.
someone behind. In reading the bill, and I understand that we need to push forward the date. But it is also, there's a lot of architecture, design, and engineering in this bill. And I just feel like this is the cart before the horse. We can extend the date, but why are we putting so much emphasis on design when we don't even know where the facility is yet?
Well, I think Mr. Ribson from DCYF would be able to give you better information that I can, but it is my understanding that they've already looked at architects and they've started the process. So I don't think that is going to be a problem. But I mean, I think we'd have better information from him.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Any other questions from the Senator?
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for all your work on this bill. I know it is an important issue that we all want to see resolved, and we want to prioritize the safety of our communities and also make sure that our most vulnerable children are getting what they need. And I think it's an important point to remember that these are our most vulnerable children. They have experienced a significant amount of trauma, and I think this is clearly we need to think what's best for them. So my question to you is, the majority of the bill is related to the closure, and sort of in addition to the closure, how does the juvenile justice system fit in with the overall system of care that we have built at a bipartisan basis? And I really think that that's such an important piece. I'm wondering, if you'd be amenable eventually to sort of looking at 5, 6, and 7. Those are sections actually that were a different House bill that were included in the Committee of Conference through negotiations. I personally think that sections 5, 6, and 7 don't really relate to the closure. And so, wondering if you'd be open to the conversation to sort of take 5, 6, and 7 out of the closure conversation.
Thank you for the question. Senator Whitley, you and I have worked together for 2 years, and we've done a lot of work together on children, and I hope that you know that I am open to all ideas.
Thank you.
So we will definitely have that discussion, and hopefully we can come to some resolution.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
You're welcome.
Any other questions from the committee? Seeing none, thank you, Senator.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you very much, Representatives. Good to see you today.
Thank you, Senator, and thank you, members of the committee. I'm Representative Bob Lynn. I'm from Wyndham, and I'm here really to address in particular one point that Senator Whitley made reference to. First of all, I should say just generally, I am a strong supporter of the main portion of this bill of closing the Sununu Center and building a new facility. I think that's critically important, and it needs to be done with some dispatch. The purpose of my testimony is to urge you to delete sections 5 through 7 of the bill, which is what Senator Whitley had referenced just a moment ago. Those are not really particularly relevant to the issue of building a new facility to house certain juveniles. They deal with a separate issue of what offenses could be the basis for either detaining or committing someone to the Sununu Center or to a successor facility. And I guess I want to make 3 quick points with respect to that. First, and please understand, I don't fault anybody for this. This gets very complicated. I frankly didn't catch this until literally this morning when I was preparing to testify. It's important to note that SB 1, as it now is drafted, and all of the amendments that I've seen that are probably going to be talked about today, none of them make any change to RSA 169B 19(1)J. And it's important to understand that it was the proposed changes to section J that were talked about last year, that was the entire basis that prompted the need for subsection M. So if you're not, and I guess what I should say is, my view last year and my view continues to be that there is nothing wrong with the existing law as reflected in either subsections 14, which deal with detention pending an adjudicatory hearing, or section 19, which deals with the offenses which can be the basis for commitment. There's nothing wrong with existing law in those two sections. The whole purpose, as you may recall, subsection J last year proposed to, and this may be a little bit inartful, but I think you'll get it, or you'll understand what I'm saying. Subsection J, the proposed changes to subsection J last year proposed to weaken or weaken the circumstances under which a juvenile could be committed to the Sununu Center or successor facility. And it was because of that weakening that there was a need, that the need for subsection M, the new subsection M, arose. In other words, I think my thinking, and I suspect many Senator Whitley's and other people's thinking was, Senator Carson, it may be yours also, that if you were going to weaken subsection J in the way that was proposed, you needed to have an escape clause or a catch-all in subsection M to make sure that it didn't go too far. But if you're not going to make any change to subsection J, as none of the bills or amendments before you do, to then add subsection M as would in effect increase or at least potentially increase the circumstances on which a juvenile could be committed. And I don't think that's anybody's intent to do that. So, that's a reason not to, that is a strong reason to remove subsections 5, 6, and 7 from the existing bill. And I guess I would just very briefly emphasize that when I said before, existing law is perfectly reasonable and proper. It doesn't allow a commitment for theft, false swearing, motor vehicle violations, or breaches of the peace if those crimes are misdemeanors. There is a 3 strikes exception, but again, critically important under existing law, commitment can only be ordered under existing law if it is the last alternative. A judge has to conclude and make findings that there's no other way, that this is the only thing that makes sense under the circumstances of the particular case. And the other thing I would say, and I think Mr. Ripsom is here and can confirm this, present law is working. I mean, there has been a dramatic decrease in the circumstances and in the number of commitments to the Sununu Center. From what it was, say, 5 or 10 years ago, a dramatic. If I said increase, I meant to say decrease. There's been a dramatic decrease in commitments to the Sununu Center over the last 5 or 10 years, which demonstrates that existing law is working. So for those reasons, I urge you to pass this bill, to pass the bill quickly, and to delete sections 5 through 7 of the bill, because I just think that they're not necessary and actually would be for the reasons I've explained, would be kind of mischievous to leave them in. I'm happy to answer any questions that anyone may have.
Thank you very much for your testimony this morning, Representative. Are there any questions from the committee? Seeing none, thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
The chair will call Representative Edwards. Good morning, Representative.
Good morning, Senator. Thank you for the opportunity to come speak to this joint committee. I'm Representative Jess Edwards. I represent Auburn, Candia, Chester, and Deerfield. I come to you today having spent about a year or more on this issue. I served last term and this term as the Division III Finance Chair of the Sununu Center because the fiscal note had come to me But that was not the first time I had touched this issue. The first time I touched this issue was when the Department of Health and Human Services started to talk to us about the study that they did through Alvarez and Marcel on some of the ways in which a replacement center could be predicated. Much of their recommendations ended up going through the process and finding its way into the bill that the committee of conference considered. I was also on the Sununu Closure Committee. That was a special committee last year. I'm one of the lone survivors. Only 2 of the 5 people on that committee have returned. The other is Representative Cody Belanger. I don't know if Cody's going to come in today. But then I saw it again on Division 3. The other thing is I was in the room when we were discussing strategy with the speaker on the House position relative to committee of conference. And I can assure you that it was the clear intention of the speaker to have us agree with the Senate on the capacity of the Sununu Center. We had agreed that it should be basically anticipated that it would have 12 residents, and that in the case of an emergency scenario or a case where people were incompatible and needed to get some physical separation in their living circumstances, that it should be physically capable of going to as many as 18. That was an agreed upon House position. And then at the committee of conference, somehow that got miscommunicated. The committee of conference process broke down as a result, and that's why we're here today, trying to fast track this, because the legislature should have been able to resolve this back in May and June, and we made a good faith effort, but just didn't get there. So with that background, I'm presenting a number of issues that we could talk about on SB1. If you look at my suit jacket, you'll notice that I have dog hair on it, and so I use dog analogies a lot. You know, to me, this is going to be a little bit like how you watch a dog lay down. It goes onto the bed and circles around 2-3 times before it figures out how it's going to lay down. I think today represents one of the circles around the bed. What I'm proposing, I'm not saying is the ultimate solution that I want us all to agree on, but I do want to raise issues throughout this so that the group collective can think through it and come up with the most rational position. What I've done is I've coordinated with Mr. Ribson and others in DHHS. There's been some Senate House discussions. I've talked to the speaker about this. Representative Lynn, who's the chair of our Judiciary, has been part of this discussion throughout the process. And Representative Mark Pearson, who's now the chair of Children and Family Law, is also on board with what I'm going to say. I'm not telling you that these are hard positions that the House wants to take with this bill, but these are the issues that we'd like to have considered. I think if you take a look at the way this process has worked, we had the committee of conference version of the bill, and that was the baseline that I believe Senator Carson has used to give you SB1. She did some significant improvement to the committee of conference report by discussing with key stakeholders what the best dates would be for actual closure. She discussed, I think it's fair to say, that if we can't hit those dates, there's an intention to give the governor some flexibility on extending the date. You know, if you just got supply chain issues, or we have a contracting suit glitch, or something, give us a little expansion there. So the committee of conference, enhanced by Senator Carson, is the baseline for what I'm going to talk about today. The key things the key issues, sort of the strategic overview of what we'll go through, I think, is try to get some alignment around the capacity issue to make sure that we know that the purpose of this center is obviously to provide behavioral and mental health in a way in which we think that we can be successful at helping these kids achieve their potential. But what got left out, I think, is that this is also a secure facility. It needs to have the public safety issues, the physical security components added to it, and I think the committee of conference report didn't really quite get there. It adds in the notion of trying to co-locate this facility so that we can share services. If you just take a hypothetical and say that we move it towards Site X, and Site X happens to be in the business of providing mental and behavioral health, then you can start to take a look at things like potentially leveraging shared manpower, looking at logistics and warehouses, looking at laundry services, looking at dining facilities. These independent services that we had to provide at the Sununu Center were huge cost drivers in how we got to about a $13 million a year budget. And it was the key motivation for the Finance Committee in the House to try to close down Sununu, because the ongoing cost structure was just perceived to be untenable, unsustainable, and that we needed a replacement facility where we could, be more intelligent about how we're going to create an efficient operation while remaining effective to the mission of supporting these kids. So co-location's a big one, so that we can share services. Also, there's the encouragement to leverage virtual services, remote services, like rather than having all of the medical staff on site, perhaps they could augment it with a telemedicine link and have somebody on site to do sort of initial triage kind of work. Rather than having every instructor hired, maybe they could lean on some remote learning capability. The words I've given you in the amendment don't dictate exactly how the department can do that. It represents an urging of the department to really build an efficient model that works. And that's what the virtualization and co-location does. There's been some discussion on community communication and agreement. I think that's a good thing that we should talk about. Wherever this gets placed, we want to make sure that we go in there as welcome guests of any community in which we operate this facility. And then it also touches on the disposal of the facility. So that's a very long introduction to what is going to be a really much longer discussion of the items. And I'm comforted because Senator Carson has told me that I should take the time it takes to get through these things properly. And if you want to revoke that at any time, Senator Carson, I certainly can appreciate it. So,
Representative, just so you know, I have the tendency to let people talk.
yeah,
I firmly believe if people are going to come here to talk to us today,
yeah.
you have the right to speak to us for as long as you need to. And you've given us a handy handout here, so we're going to be able to follow you.
Yep.
And I hope you don't mind if you get interrupted during your presentation because somebody wants to ask a question.
Yes, ma'am. And if the chair would permit it, if anyone wants to have sort of not just a question, but a sort of a discussion to help resolve something a little bit more in the minds of the committee, I'm open to that. But obviously, that's at the discretion of the chair. Since we're trying to fast track this, anything I think we can do to get that agreement on paper would be useful. But.
Thank you, Senator. It must be, Representative, it must be the district because we're thinking the same thing. My goal today is to try to get this resolved as much as we can, so we can get this through both houses with, a minimal amount of disruption, because this is extremely important for the state to get this done.
Yes, ma'am. To the extent I'm thinking like you, it's because you've been my senator now for 4 terms, and I must be using your mentorship. But so in SB 1, you don't see any changes until you get down to around line 12 of SB 1. And then in that paragraph, and this is where you all should have my Word document with notes. It's got bolded stuff. This is not as good as when the LBA does a side-by-side. Mine is sort of an inline Word document and not a nice side-by-side. But LBA would probably never hire me. But okay, so in that first sentence, I'm recommending we strike the phrase "is no more than 12 beds" to replace the current Sununu Youth Services Center with a capacity for a census in the event of a surge. In talking to community stakeholders, the word surge is offensive. So, what I'm trying to do with this replacement is to communicate the same concept, but in less offensive terms. So I would propose replacing that with has a maximum physical capacity of 18 beds with an operational plan to support 12 to 14 to replace the current Sununu Youth Services Center. Now, I've used the range 12 to 14 because as an old manpower manager, the planning for your manpower isn't really precise. But I know that there's a Senator Bradley amendment where he just hard codes this to 12. Instead of being 12 to 14, it could just be 12. And that's fine. The department can plan for 12 residents, I think. So I think that's one area that we could just decide on if you want to go to 12 to 14 or just hard coding at 12. Then the next strike through is the department shall consult with any prospective community about the location and operation of any new or rehabilitated 12-bed facility with the capacity for a census of 18 in the event of the surge. So I deleted some of this just because I didn't think we needed to keep saying what the capacity is. We just need to say it once, and that's where it is. So my proposal there is to say the department shall consult with any prospective community about the location and operation of any new facility. That gets in the general direction, I think, that several senators and other community leaders would like. What it does differ a little bit, I think, from the Bradley amendment. The Bradley amendment, I think, has some language in it that suggests that it's the state's obligation to accept any reasonable accommodation requested by the community. And while as a negotiating principle, I wouldn't mind advising the state to do that, what I would be concerned about is just giving up negotiation leverage too early in the process. And then if they don't like what we end up deciding, because it's in law, is the term, giving up all reasonable accommodations, does that become a basis of a potential suit and to slow us down? So for those reasons, I'd rather do less is more in this regard about communicating with the community. The next strike through, the facility shall be operated by the Department of Health and Human Services. I think there's a key philosophical issue here. I strike through operated and I use the word administered instead. The distinction in using those two words is if you tell them that they have to operate it, that means every employee, or implies that certainly that every employee shall be a state employee. And what I think we've heard in the closure committee was that there is a model that could work where the state retains responsibility for the overall administration and management of the operation, but then may want to contract out portions of the work so that they have a hybrid approach instead of a strict state-run model. So that's a management decision on the part of the committee. I recommend going with the administrated route instead of operated to give the department the flexibility to really design something that is effective and efficient. The next part of it is I added the phrase with support and shared services contracts as appropriate. So that whole sentence would read, the facility shall be administered by the department with support and shared services contracts as appropriate. I'm not trying to put our hand on their decisions. I just say, look at this and do what you think is appropriate.
Senator Whitley has a question or comment.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. Sort of both. I mean, so just thinking about your change to whether this facility, whether any new facility should be operated, administered by the department. I think, from my perspective, there have been around the country sort of, private companies that are running facilities, and their track record hasn't been in the best interests of children. And so, we don't want to get in a situation where we have a private prison company running a facility with our most vulnerable children. And so that's the balance that I want to strike in this conversation about who actually runs the facility.
Thank you for the question and the opportunity to clarify. You and I are in violent agreement. What you just said is consistent with what we heard in the Sununu Closure Center, where we became aware that there are facilities that have been totally contracted out, and then, the ability of the state to ensure the effective operation was damaged as a result of having too little direct control, which is why instead of leaving it kind of, naked, that the whole thing can get privatized, I maintain that the department shall administer the whole thing and use those contracts as appropriate. So I think our concern is the same. My approach is just documented here and may be better to be, tweaked a little bit, but.
Do you have a question? Okay. You're all set? Okay, please continue.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so then we're going on, for me, on my notes, it's the next page, and it's that section that looks to be, to me, around line 21 of page 1, but I recommend, because this is a redundant reference to the capacity, and I think it's better to just do the capacity once and then quit talking about it. I strike census shall not exceed 12 or 18 in the event of a surge. I just change it to that the facility shall have the capability for alternative flexible use when the census so permits. So the idea is that if you have an unusually higher number of census and you start to run into scenarios where the juveniles that are residents there bring with them sort of the social strife of their community, i.e. gang tension, for example, that there is a way to create some physical segregation so that there's less opportunity to spark, violence or other issues. So even if you only had 12, you'd still want to give the department some opportunity to flex that space a little bit to help provide for a more secure environment internally. And then on my page of notes, you'll see where I say Ribson tweaks. And Mr. Ribson had told me this once or twice before, and for some reason I'm just not a very good admin. But I would go with what Mr. Ribson is requesting. The Department of Health and Human Services, in collaboration with the Department of Administrative Services, shall issue a request, strike for proposal, because an RFP is my term and not theirs, a request to procure a qualified architect, delete the phrase design build, on or before March 1, 2023. So you can see the urgency that we're trying to move. We want to authorize them to go start trying to contract this thing rapidly, and shall collaborate to issue a request to procure a contractor to build the resulting construction project. I skipped over some strike-throughs there that you can see on the paper. And again, I think he's right about that. The only thing I might consider keeping, well, I guess I would consider keeping it, is I inserted the phrase go live before the phrase opening of the facility. And this I think passes the common sense test. You could technically have the building open, but you may not have everything in place, the procedures, the training, the people, you may not have all of that in place for a little while still. And so it isn't just the opening of the facility, it's sort of the ability to go live and meet the obligations. So that may not be necessary just because it's sort of common sense, but I inserted it because
I don't want to interrupt you, but to go back to the Ribson tweaks, it does say to issue a request to procure, and it's using the March 1st, 2023. Do you think that that's an appropriate date?
I'm going to let Mr. Ribson nod, or what? He says he's already done it.
Okay. I just want to make sure. I didn't know how far along in the process you were. So, okay, we're good.
Yeah. So the first time I shared this language with Mr. Ribson was what, November? Or, yeah, so.
Okay.
Okay. All right.
So they're good.
Okay, so now we're in Roman numeral paragraph 3. The facility shall be designed to include, and this is where we're all agreeing, but we need to be complete. We want a physical design that complements therapeutic and trauma-informed care of youth, including a home-like interior and exterior. And then I'm inserting the words to the maximum extent, or to the maximum practical extent. I just am, thinking that there may be some trade-off in the design between appropriate physical security and a home-like environment. And I just, I just want to make sure that we're building. I think that the term is a stage 5 or level 5 physical secure location. Without the Sununu Center, the most secure setting we have is a level 4. And don't ask me what those level differentiations are, but I know that 5 is more secure than 4. And so I don't want to have us create security gaps by overemphasizing the homey nature of the interior or exterior. Okay, down to C, maintain SB1 capacity to provide services to meet the medical, physical, and behavioral health needs of all potentially eligible children. And then my insertion would be while leveraging virtualization of appropriate services. the practice of telepsychiatry has been going on since the 1960s. It was done initially with Dartmouth and then by the University of Nebraska. So after 70 years of experience in telemedicine delivering psychiatric services, I just think that we ought to allow the design of this facility to embed some telemedicine supplementation to other services.
Representative, just a quick question. While these children are in the care of the state, one of the things that we're required to do is to provide education for these students. So while you spoke of telehealth, would it be appropriate to, and we don't need to include this, but that we are also talking about education as well?
Yes, ma'am. I think when we get to subparagraph E, that will start to get into the neighborhood you're talking about.
Okay.
And then if it's not adequate, then that's where I think it would get fixed. But, okay, so in Delta, there's a bunch of strike through and with basically a replacement. So it now would read space for no more than 18 beds, including space with flexibility to meet the needs of both genders, safety and security, crisis stabilization, admissions and discharges. The operational support plan shall anticipate 12 to 14 residents. Again, that could be hard-coded, and this is an exception to my own rule that we should only mention capacity once, but there it is. And for the stakeholders, yes, ma'am.
Senator Avard has a question.
Just a quick question. How did we derive at 18?
Well, first, my derivation is driven by what I heard and was taught by the department. We had many opportunities for the department to come in. They laid down their census and what appears to be the most recent history of where we're operating kind of a stable state situation where the census bounces around from 12 to 14. And then I think the 18 number, the flexibility issue, came up as a result of the department thinking through the problem of what if you had more kids? What if you had kids that are just incompatible with being with each other? What would you do if you had male and female residents and you wanted to segregate them? And because they can't anticipate exactly what the population would be, it was, I think, their judgment that if you built it for 12 and you could go up to 18 just by moving space around, like moving walls, moving furniture, that kind of thing, that they would be able to operate with that kind of an environment.
Thank you.
Senator Abbas has a question.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for taking my question. The number of 12 to 18, was there any consideration with that number that would involve the potential for children from coming from out of state as well?
Senator Abbas, I'm so sorry. I do have a hearing deficit, and it was just kind of hard for me to get that above a muffle.
The number 12 to 18, was that number taking into consideration that there may be children coming from surrounding states as well that would be serviced at the Sununu Center?
Thank you for repeating your question. I apologize for the inconvenience. I think later in here, we specifically touch upon the termination of the existing concept of being able to contract out to take kids from other states or to have our kids go out of state. There's a section in here that we'll bring up in a bit that says, we're going to stop doing that. We don't take, we don't give. We do it in-house. So, does that address your concern for now?
I may follow up at a different time.
Okay, there'll be a paragraph. Okay, so here we are at Echo. Adequate space to meet the educational needs of all youth, including youth with special education needs. And then I've added, while appropriately leveraging virtual educational support services. During the pandemic, we had some experience with remote learning. We learned a lot of lessons about what doesn't work and what might work. And so I'm just thinking that there might be a way to augment, maybe it's somebody who understands European history better than the teacher on staff, that they're, so again, I'm not telling them how to do it. I'm just saying, please consider this.
Senator Birdsall has a question.
Thank you for taking my question. I'm not sure if you would be answering the question or Mr. Ripson would, but who currently administers the educational opportunities at the Sununu Center?
The state has access to, I think, 4 or 5 instructors or teachers, and Mr. Ripson will do the details. But, I'm sure when you get more than one, somebody's got to be in charge. So I assume that one of them has the lead in coordinating educational services, but he has the details.
All right, I'll wait for Mr. Ripson.
All right. Okay. The next one is G, capacity to meet the nutritional needs of all youth. And this is my ad, meet the nutritional needs of all youth either on site or in close proximity. So what does that mean? That means that there might be a kitchen in the facility next door that prepares the food and moves the food down to this new facility so that you don't have to have 2 kitchens, 2 cooking staffs. And this language, I don't think mandates separate kitchens, but if that's what they can do to gain some efficiency, then that's just an option. Or maybe instead of having 24/7 services, which I think they currently do now, if you walk through the facility, they have like a basket of granola and fruit out, 24/7, rather than trying to do 24/7. Maybe they say, okay, we're going to do the main meals Monday through Friday in-house, and on the weekend we're going to go to a different structure. And I think that can be made to work just based on my military experience. You don't necessarily have to have every kitchen you own up and running, as long as you can get food to the troops. The next one is hotel. Necessary elements to be architecturally secure and equipped with video surveillance. And I added in compliance with a specific RSA because, the governor signed a new law and this video surveillance basically says that they need to achieve a 98% uptime. They need to remain technologically current. They need to be able to store the video to a legal length of time, so there's a data retention requirement in there, and then there's a video quality requirement in there that that it's actually good enough video that you can observe the behavior of any one individual relative to a group. So we have a new law that does all of that I thought it would be worth citing. Next one is I. This is completely new to the SB1. Operations shall leverage virtual and shared services support to achieve efficiencies while maintaining effectiveness and public safety. I won't elaborate because we've talked about this already, but it may be that my language is a little too strong. That maybe that could be backed off a little bit to make sure it's more clear that the managers of the Sununu Center think about this stuff and use it rather than direct them to do it. Then in Roman numeral 4A, added a phrase in there so that the new sentence reads, staff qualifications, standard job descriptions, and training that emphasize the treatment of youth with behavioral health challenges. So this was an example of how in Alvarez and Marcel, all the way through this process, we've kind of overlooked the implicit requirement that this has to be a secure facility and that we need to have people inside the facility who can handle violence and disruption. So in order to make sure that we just don't have a bunch of people who are good at counseling, we also have somebody that can step in the case of an emergency. And so I added the phrase, while providing self and group physical security protection with a population having considerable trauma histories. So yes, the Sununu Center's concept, when it was first formed, was mostly around incarceration. And yes, we do want to transfer to a therapeutic environment, but we can't completely overlook in the process of conversion that public safety and physical security are still vital to the operation of the center. So that's why that got added there. Dropping down to echo, added the word appropriate, only to make sure that, if there are inappropriate opportunities for families to have daily access, that there's some discretion in determining which activities may not be appropriate to try to bring family members in. So it's flexibility, it's not a mandate. Did you have a question, Senator Carson? You look like you might have.
No.
Okay. Dropping to Foxtrot, added a sentence at the bottom, and this is more on the educational issue. Virtual educational opportunities shall be leveraged appropriately to help meet youth needs. So the word appropriately, the education specialists might go, in this environment, there are no appropriate virtual education opportunities, and so they have none. But I just want to make sure that they've thought through it and leveraged it where it's appropriate. Am I repeating myself? This is starting to sound familiar. Physical and personal security to maintain safety of staff and residents as well as public safety externally. This was, I think, a common sense remark that just had been left out of SB 1. So that would be my recommendation there. Going to Roman numeral 6. I think this is just, the LBA will get this right, but I just noticed that I think the Joint Legislative Oversight Committee, the word oversight got left out, but that's just a technical issue on whatever the right word is. And then 3, is a wholly new paragraph dealing with the disposition of the Sununu Center. And this wholly new provision is basically, I will take the blame for this if there's criticism to be launched, but I think possession and disposal of the Sununu Center as of the date of the opening of the new Youth Development Center set forth in this act, the Department of Administrative Services shall take possession of the entire property currently housing the Sununu Center on South River Road. The department shall dispose of the property, and any revenues received shall be deposited in the general fund. The department shall consult with the city of Manchester, and there was huge agreement on this, so we should be talking to Manchester. But then the next part is a concept I've added, and I've said the business and industry association, and I think I may have gotten that word wrong. I don't think it's industry as much as it's economic. The Business Economic Association, Mr. Caswell's group, I think they should be consulted, and other organizations as appropriate prior to any sale of the property, returning the property to the property tax and business tax rolls shall be a high priority. And that's just me thinking about economic development. Let's not take that real estate and not make money off of it in the future. So the committee may want to just strike all of that or keep some of it. I'm not sure. And then there's a renumbering of a paragraph in there. And then we get to what was paragraph 4, just a regular 4, and it would become a 5. dealing with other states and jurisdictions. So the phrase operation obligations of the Sununu Youth Center and replacement facility, when I actually read what was in here, it seemed like a different headline for this section was more appropriate and just called other states and jurisdictions. And then in listening to my colleague, Representative Lynn, for the last 9 months on this, he recommends striking a lot of this, and then when we get down to the section effective with the expiration of the current contract with the state of Vermont, neither the Sununu Youth Services Center nor the replacement facility shall enter into an agreement to serve children from another state or jurisdiction. I think that's to your point, Senator Abbas. And these are words that are in SB1, and I'm not changing those.
You can ask a question, Senator.
Yeah, my concern was if they're not going to take service any children from out of state, how would that factor into the location where this facility would be? Because it's my understanding there is no facility that's been actually, no location has been selected yet. So
if I'm muffled. What I'm hearing the question to be is, what do we do in the case of an emergency where we're not ready to have the kids in New Hampshire and we need to contract elsewhere?
The question I'm asking, or what I was getting towards, is if we're not going to be servicing any children from out of state, then where would the ideal location for this facility be? Because I'm not sure of all the surrounding communities, what their thoughts on it. I heard 3 different potential locations: Manchester, Concord, and Hampstead. But if it's not going to service any children from out of state, is that being factored into where the location would be?
So I think that's a fair question for the department, and I don't think they want to do that in public session because of the sensitive nature of trying to do these negotiations. So what this legislation does basically is it sets up a concept and a framework, and and so your question I think might be better addressed to the commissioner or somebody on how they would handle it. The reason why we're saying no more Vermont kids is because we entered into a contract with them. We had very few takers, and meanwhile, if we do not plan on those, we can aim for a smaller capacity. That's why we can get down to a capacity of an operation of 12 and a physical flex of 18. So if you brought in kids from Vermont, that would increase our capacity requirements conceivably. So I'm dodging your question a little bit. So. Okay, so.
I'm sorry, Senator Avard has a question.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And thank you for taking my question. Basically going back to, well, now if we run into this point where we're not taking others and we can't send others, I'm going to use that offensive word, surge. And what if we have 20 or 25 kids that need services? Now we can't send them out of state. What do we do with them?
Senator Avard, that's a perfectly fine and appropriate question. I have not addressed that in this amendment because there was so much anxiety around whether it should be 6 or 12, ability to go to 18, that we couldn't get agreement and pass legislation within that narrower range. Mm-hmm. So my estimate of the situation was that it would be better to stick with the plowed ground and not take on an entirely new political issue that would have all kinds of opposition. Where my head is at is that the legislature failed to give the department what it needed in June. And so they're behind the curve, and I'm glad to hear the department has taken some intermediary actions to keep the ball moving forward. But I really feel like it's incumbent upon us as the legislature to go ahead and get this over the finish line and give them guidance. It's not to say you don't have a good point. It's just to say it's a point that I think if the time is kind of passed on that question, but
Thank you.
yeah.
Senator Avard, I believe Mr. Ribson is going to come up to testify, so I think that would be a question to ask him.
Consider it done.
No, I do want to share a little history in Division 3. Division 3 House, I had enjoyed a remarkable track record with my committee to where we all agreed to the same sorts of things. The one time that there was strong disagreement to where I lost my caucus was when they wanted 6 and I wanted the 12 to 18. So even within my own caucus, there was not an appetite for more than 6 then. Since then, I think there's been some softening, realizing the criticality of, getting something done. But I'm just letting you know that, going beyond a physical flexibility of 12 is probably more than this process will tolerate. Sorry. Okay, lots of strike-throughs. We're getting close to the end. And then I emerge after a lot of strike-throughs at the paragraph dealing with repeal. That was paragraph 8 in SB 1 and would become 6 if it got renumbered the way I suggested. And from repeal on, I maintained all the language of SB 1. So subject to your questions, I want to thank you for your patience in allowing me to go through it. I think I just summarized probably a couple hundred hours of thumb wrestling this issue, and so it was good to be able to share that cathartically, if nothing else.
Okay. I need to check this and this. Okay. Thank you very much for all of your work on this, Representative. We really appreciate your thoughts on this. And are there any further questions from the committee? Okay.
All right, with that, I just, as you know, I'm going to remain open and available. And the part of this I didn't say is my intent is if you all can get something that's pretty agreeable to you, then I'm scheduled on the 17th to meet Children and Family Law. I have my own bill in, and my intent would be to do something Senator Bradley taught me on the dental Medicaid benefit. I would try to amend my bill so that it's compatible with what the Senate has said, so that now instead of having 2 different versions in the House and Senate, we're trying to just move, one version that's one Senate bill and one House bill. So that's my legislative strategy, and therefore I think I need to remain aware of what the Senate decides.
Okay. Thank you very much, Representative. We appreciate all your work. Okay. Next, we're going to call Joe Ribson.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Joe Ripsum, Director of DCOIF. Great to see everybody this morning. A big thank you to Senator Carson and Senator Birdsell for entertaining this critical bill and critical issue so promptly in the legislative session, and committing to move this quickly as we all need to. I appreciate that everybody seems to understand the urgency, and I appreciate also Representative Edwards' commitment to moving this rapidly through the House as well and working to get this all on one page. I'm just very, very grateful for everybody's efforts on this front. What I just passed around was just census data from SYSC, which I think can help us get to some of the questions that Senator Avard raised. So what we have here, the data, this is actually the daily census going back from July 2016 through January 1st of this year. The green line at the top is the total number of kids in the facility at any given time. The blue or purple line, depending on how your color works in your eyes, is the committed population. The orange line is the detained population. And you do see kind of this rapid decrease, from 2016 through about the 2019-ish, which coincides with changes in the law around who could be detained and committed, and also coincides with kind of the advent of the children's system of care that we were building, right? So you kind of had a bunch of new services come online for how we were going to support and serve kids, and at the same time you had changes in laws to who would be detained and committed. And since that time, with the exception of a little bit of a peak there, shortly after in early 2020, the census has remained between lows of 5 and highs of about 16, 17. And that census, as you can see here, can swing pretty drastically quickly, even within the past couple months. If you just look at this last bit here, we were as high as 16 kids in October and as low as 5 kids in November. We were back up to 12 kids on the 1st. We're up to 15 kids today. We anticipate being down to 13 on Friday, right? So the census is a dynamic thing, but it does stay on average at about 12. And that's kind of what we have been for a couple years now. We haven't gotten above that 18 number, but we have gotten close to it a few times in the past 3 years. And I'm happy to take questions if the chair.
Thank you, and I appreciate that. Thank you very much. And these are all just New Hampshire citizens?
That's
not
right.
Vermont?
That's correct. This data excludes the kids that were coming in on the Vermont contract. The only non-New Hampshire kids in here are kids that we would have to continue to serve going forward because there's something called the Interstate Compact on Juveniles, which is if a child from out of state gets picked up in New Hampshire for an out-of-state like warrant or something like that, or for a crime they commit within New Hampshire. So, we could have a child who maybe has a warrant from Massachusetts, they get picked up in New Hampshire, they stay at SYIC for a couple days while the processes occur, and then they go back to Massachusetts. Those kids will continue to go to the new facility. The contract with Vermont actually expired in October. We did not renew that contract. We actually stopped taking kids from Vermont in August because our own staffing situation had gotten to the point that we just couldn't handle taking more kids in, much to their dismay because they're really struggling to manage their own system. But, we had our own challenges to worry about.
Thank you.
Yep.
Senator Whitley?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thanks, Director Ribson, for taking my question. So the fluctuation that you're seeing from about 5 to 16 to 7, is that fluctuation just with detained kids or also with committed?
It's a mix, right? So if you look at the orange and blue lines there, that's the distinction between detained and committed. And you can see there are times where our committed population is higher and our detained population is higher. But the total census is that kind of green line that floats at the top. So it really does bounce between your detained and your committed population. And I would remind folks, this is the only facility in the state, the only secured facility for males, females, at all detained committed population. And that actually makes us the state, at least according to the data that was released a couple of years ago, with the lowest combined detained and committed population in the country. So there's not a whole lot of room to go down by comparison.
Follow up?
Yes, follow up.
So I'm wondering if you can give a sense of, of this, say, 17 children, the nature of why they're in there. I mean, because I think, I think it's important to be concrete about what kids we're talking about. Because some kids, are they just having repeated encounters with law enforcement and that's why they're getting in there? Or are these kids that are, not able to get the supports that they need from other residential facilities? And surely there's probably a small handful of children who have committed serious crimes. But I think, when we talk about this facility, I don't want to speak in, these hyperbolic terms. I really want to understand who these kids are.
Yeah. So there's a combination. So, the most serious offenses that we will get in there, those kids are typically in there pending adult charges, right? And that at any given time is only maybe 1 or 2 kids who maybe are, pending adult charges for something like murder or attempted murder. And those kids are going to spend their minority with us until they turn 18 and then move on to the adult system. That typically is, since I've been there, I think the most of those kids we've had at one time is 3. But there's, always a couple of those kids, 1, 2, 3 of those kids in the building. Your committed population tends to be kids who have committed some type of a violent offense. and they could be in there for commitment typically for 3 to 6 months before they're eligible for parole. And then depending on how well they're doing on parole, or how well they're doing in the facility, they may be paroled at that point to a step-down facility, or they might end up having to stay longer until they're able to demonstrate that they're doing better. And again, those typically are for, some type of violent offense. It could be a series of, simple assaults, or it could be, 1 or 2 more severe violent offenses. And then your detained population is a little bit more fluid. Those could be kids, they can't be detained for things that are, like shoplifting or anything like that. They also tend to be things like simple assaults or things like that, but they could be series of simple assaults. A lot of them actually are domestic violence type situations where they're getting in fights in their home with their parents, things like that. Law enforcement comes in and they're trying to separate the situation, calm it down, and typically it's multiple instances. You don't have a single instance resulting in a child being detained. Those detentions, those could be short term, from just a couple days to a couple months, and oftentimes it depends on how well the child's doing when they get to the facility, and it depends on our ability to identify a step-down facility for them to go to. So one of the changes we've made in recent years, and one of the things that SB1 and the House version that Representative Edwards put forward anticipates, is that we've actually integrated a lot of our broader system of care into SYSC, so that care management attaches and starts working with those kids to try to figure out how to step those kids down into less restrictive placements or bring them back to the community when they get into SYSC. So that work all starts with that detained population, and kind of depending on how well we're able to find a way to get those kids out, often kind of impacts how long they stay there. We have had a real challenge really since the start of COVID, lasting through now, with workforce issues in step-down programs, right? Residential programs and places like that have really struggled with workforce, which I think have made our census maybe push a little bit higher than it might have otherwise. A couple kids at any given time that could be elsewhere that are kind of stuck waiting a placement, waiting a bed to open up. So there is a little bit of that pressure that we're experiencing today as well. But all of these kids, and I talked about their crimes, but actually what I failed to say, and what I should have said, is that when you look at the histories of all of these kids, they all have severe trauma histories. These are all kids who mostly have abuse and neglect in their backgrounds. These are kids who have behavioral health issues for the most part. These are kids who have substance use disorders. I mean, these are kids who have a lot going on in their lives and a lot of treatment needs beyond simply the behaviors that they're displaying, right? So, and that's really why it's so critical to not just think about this as a place where you're locking a kid up, but a place where you're trying to meet those underlying needs, so that you can hopefully get to a place where these kids are able to turn their lives around and have a productive life.
I guess first a comment and then a question. I really like the idea that Representative Edwards put in here, the issue of virtual services, especially with telehealth, because you could have a child be committed to the center, but they might be seeing therapists outside the center. So you have that continuity of care. And so it's not that disruptive.
Yep.
They can still have that. And I think for some children, that's extremely important, because once they're released, they will continue to see the same people when they go back to their neighborhoods and their families. The other question that I had was with the Ribsome tweak, that's going to be a new term here. When you talk about, when there was a discussion in the document that Representative Edwards presented us with, and now I'm trying to find what I did with it, dealing with the architectural design of the center. Can you speak to us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so the tweak language, so the language that's there primarily was the same language that was in SB1, with the exception of changing the language around the type of procurement tool that DAS uses, because they don't actually use a request for procurement. That's not the tool they use to procure. But yeah, the question around the time frame. So we had actually started the process. DAS had actually already put out a request to procure an architect. We're not entering into a contract with anybody until this process is over with in the legislature and until appropriations made. But we wanted to get ahead of the curve in terms of being able to go as soon as we were given the green light, because, the anticipation and the, around trying to get to this project finished, there's a lot of pressure around that. So we've actually already gone through a process of putting out a request for architects, interviewing some architects, and are in negotiations with an architect, but no contract can actually be entered into or brought to governor and council until a procurement is made and until a decision is made about this. Part of the part of that contract will include helping do site reviews around the 3 different possible locations, around what's actually viable in terms of where a potential future facility would be located. So that's also part of what's going to feed into, a future decision about where we may put a new facility. Because while there's ideas about where a new facility might go, there hasn't been the type of site work done to figure out what's actually viable.
Okay, I have one final question. In the document that Representative Edwards gave us in the first section, where it says the facility shall be operated, and he has crossed out operated and put in administered. Can you talk a little bit about that, if there's any impact whatsoever?
I'll be honest, I didn't see those 2 words as being all that different, right? We currently subcontract out services at SYSC. Our clinical services, our psychiatrists, psychologists, and clinicians are contracted out. Some of our educational services are contracted out. Our physician services are contracted out. So that's something that's already a current practice, and a practice that I would anticipate we'd continue to do in a future facility. Really, as the guidepost being, when is it most economical and when is it in the best interest of kids to contract out versus when is it more economical and in the best interest of kids to use our own staff, is kind of the way we try to make those decisions. And that's how I'd anticipate we'd continue to make those decisions going forward.
Thank you. Senator Birdsall has a question, then Senator Adams.
Thank you. Thank you for taking my question. I had said this before, and when the senator got up to present the bill, but from reading through this bill it seems like it addresses more of replacement facilities versus actually extending the closure, although it does include the closure. We have heard that there are 3 possible places: Manchester, Concord, and Hampstead. Have these municipalities been notified that they are in the top running for this replacement facility?
No, there's not been conversations about that yet. We're still in this process of making sure we're going to be allowed to build a building or go anywhere. So no, those conversations haven't happened yet, but that certainly would be a key part of what has to happen as we move forward with any plans. And as I said, part of the role of the architect would be even to figure out whether sites that have been thought about, contemplated, or even viable.
So if they haven't been notified, but yet we have an architect ready to go, how does he know what to design and where to design it?
So again, part of the architect's role is going to be help doing the site reviews to figure out what is the appropriate space, right? So the design of a building and the type of things that we want in the building are somewhat different than, what the physical site is going to be, and those 2 things are going to have to come together at some point. But at this point, we don't actually have the architect. There's not a contract. There's no money being paid. We are just going through the process so that once the legislature says, here's your resources, here's your authorization, we can go to governor and council as soon as possible to get moving, because at least from my reading of the tea leaves, there's a lot of pressure around getting this done as quickly as possible, and we wanted to be prepared to do that.
Thank you.
Senator Abbas?
Thank you, Madam Chair. And thank you for taking my question.
Yes.
If the 3 locations are not, none of them been deemed viable yet, what would happen if none of them were deemed viable?
Then we'd have to go back to the drawing board, but I'd assume that I would imagine we will find at least one of the locations to be deemed viable. I mean, one of them is the current site of the current facility. So.
Alpha?
And just to follow up, if there's been no consultation with any of the local communities, if there's any objection from some of the local potential spots, how is that going to be handled?
Yeah, so certainly we would engage with local communities about what it is we're doing and what the plans are and what the impact would be. I think the facility that we've operated at SYSC, the secured facility, not talking about the non-secured programs that have been run there in the past, they are fully secured, and we haven't had issues around things of kids absconding or anything like that, which is a lot of what communities worry about. So I think we'd be, pretty good neighbors, but those are certainly conversations we'd want to have with folks and try to help folks, understand and give input and try to figure out how to make this work.
Oh,
Thank you. In respect to the potential for the Hampstead location, Hampstead's a small community, so would there be any collaboration with some of the surrounding communities as well?
Yeah, I would imagine so.
Thank you.
Senator Bradley?
Good morning, Director. So I just want to make sure I understood what you said, referring to Amendment 6, the Carson-Edwards Amendment. In your mind, there is no difference between administration and operation, is that correct?
Yeah, I did not see a big difference between those two terms.
And that
so.
language would not allow a private operator to come and run the facility?
That's not how I would read that language to fully privatize the facility, and certainly is not how I want to run the facility.
All right, further?
Yes.
On the amendment, the line 28 and 29, the facility shall have capability for alternative flexible use when the census permits. I'm not exactly sure what's intended there. If this was a suggestion of yours, what is?
No, I think that Representative Edwards came up with that language. I think the original version that we had for that had different language there. And I actually think that the original intent from the amendment from last year was not so much about the use of the facility concurrently, but a potential future use of the facility. So the idea that when we built this facility, we were doing it with the idea that should there be a future date where we realized that 18 beds was more than we needed, that we could convert this into a treatment program. That was the idea in the original alternative use language that was in the original bill last year. And I'm okay with that still. So the idea being that should we decide 10, 20 years from now that this building is not the right building, that it could convert into, say, a psychiatric residential treatment facility, and that we should design it with those ideas in mind so that we wouldn't end up in the situation we are today with a building that's really designed for a correctional purpose that doesn't meet the needs of kids in other settings.
Okay. I know there've been questions on the date for the architect. I think a better way to write it would be to make sure that there's a commitment to hire an architect within a 30-day or whatever period of time after the effective date of the chapter, as opposed to March 1st. I think that's a better way to do it. Okay, section 5 in the amendment really caught my attention. I'm not sure if you're proposing it, if it's, in any case, it seems to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, that we are totally diminishing any flexibility if we have a hard and fast that will not take any kids from any other state, that we're not going to be able to send our kids to any other state if we absolutely have to.
Yeah, so that was language that was actually added in the committee of conference last year. It was not language that the department sought or submitted. So that's not language that I'm attached to in any way. We have no intention of contracting with another state for the use of the facility going forward, especially the smaller facility. We don't think it'd be possible to contract with another state for it. But yeah, that's not language that was critical to us.
And my last question, Madam Chair, like everybody else that's testified so far this morning, you are good to go with striking sections 5, 6, 7.
Absolutely. Those were also sections that were part of trying to reach a compromise that weren't critical to us.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Senator Whitley has a question.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for taking another question. So, there's been a lot of discussion and certainly a lot of attention to staffing at the current facility. And, we just don't want to be in a situation where, both staff and children are unsafe because of a staffing crisis.
Right.
So I wonder if you can, talk about your plans in the meantime, to ensure that we have qualified staff and that children can remain safe and staff can remain safe.
Yeah, I mean, we've been in a very difficult situation for the last number of months, and probably will remain in a very tight situation until we get over this hump of this legislation, right? So, you have a couple dynamics happening at once. You have what's been a workforce crisis, particularly around this type of workforce, right? I talked about the challenges in hiring staff in residential programs. It's just as bad, if not worse, for hiring folks for correctional type facilities and juvenile justice facilities, not just in New Hampshire, but nationally. I get clips every morning from all over the country that talk about this crisis. What we've been able to do in the past few months was we had to start off by mandating juvenile justice staff to pick up shifts down there, and that's really been tough. People were not happy about that, obviously. We've fortunately gotten to a point where enough people were willing to volunteer that we've been able to get by with volunteers for the past couple months. And hopefully that'll hold out for us, to get us through. But I think there's a couple critical things that need to happen to get us past that point. Number one is getting clarity on the future, right? It's really hard to hire people when, on paper, this facility is going to close in 2 months and people don't think they're going to have a job. And two, we need to do something about wages. And I am hopeful that we're going to see that resolved. There's what I'm hearing about collective bargaining agreement coming forward is pretty promising. There's a new kind of, I don't know the right terminology for it, but a new rebanding or reclassification process happening around this as well. And I think between those efforts, we're going to see those issues resolved around wages for these folks and really move them into a place where they're competitive. But those two issues, I think, really need to get resolved before we really are able to get to the other side of this challenge we're having with hiring appropriate frontline workforce for the building.
Okay. Senator Birdsall has a question.
Thank you for taking my question. And this will be my last one, I promise. I spoke with Hampstead Hospital was taken over by the state. What was it, a year and a half ago or so?
Not quite, but yeah.
So I had a conversation with the police department yesterday, and my understanding is that finally the state police have signed an MOU with Hampstead Hospital so that the state police will be taking over any issues with Hampstead Hospital. But it took almost a year for the state police to sign the MOU with the Hampstead Police Department. My understanding is it was because HHS took so long to sign the agreement with the state police. Can you assure me or this committee that that won't happen again? Because this is being fast-tracked and we need to make sure that everything is in place for whatever facility, wherever they decide to put that facility,
Yep.
that the agreements are in place.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I'm not sure I wasn't part of those processes, so I'm not sure what happened there, but, it's being fast tracked obviously through the legislature, but best case scenario, you're talking, 18 months. And I think that's ambitious that you have a new building opened to serve this population. So we'll certainly make sure that we're doing all of that legwork well before a new building opens and serves kids and those things are in place before a kid steps foot in the new facility.
One last question, not necessarily. I just want to make sure this is going to finance, correct?
Yes.
Okay,
There you go.
thank you.
Okay. Are there any further questions for Mr. Ribson? Okay, seeing none. Thank you very much,
Thank
Mr.
you.
Ribson. Let me find my sheet here. Next, we're going to have hear from Michelle Wangerin. Good morning.
First, so my name is Michelle Longren. I am the law project director and New Hampshire Legal Assistance. I'm sorry. And I am testifying today on behalf of New Hampshire Legal Assistance as well as the Juvenile Reform Project, which is a coalition of organizations that include NHLA, the Disabilities Rights Center New Hampshire, Waypoint, New Futures, and American Civil Liberties Union New Hampshire. And first of all, I want to start by just really thanking the committees for coming together and treating this with the urgency it deserves. We were very involved in the process last year, and we really appreciated all the collaboration that went into getting this bill to the point that it is in now. And while it didn't quite cross the finish line last year, we think that SB1 and the work that's been done also on the House end gets us really close to that point so that we know that it will cross the finish line this year and get this moving in the best interest of kids. one thing I would just be remiss not to say is that we also view this as a very urgent situation. You heard Director Ribson talk about the staffing crisis at the facility, and we agree that the number one goal has to be making sure that there is a plan to ensure that the department can retain staff, can hire staff with the appropriate qualifications, and that can be assured some security in employment and longevity of their careers. So if there is no other goal, it is making sure that they can hire those appropriately qualified staff that have that security. Secondly, while I'm testifying here in favor of a bill that puts in place incarceration for kids, which is something that is fraught with all kinds of complexities, I would also be remiss if I didn't say that while we are testifying in full support of sections 1 through 4 of this bill, we recognize that there's still a tremendous amount of done to build out the system of care. And we hope that that process and the funding for that process is built out simultaneously, because while we're talking about the number of beds and is 12 enough, is 18 enough, it will be enough if we have the services in place to serve this population of youth, and we can be sure of that. And while there's been a lot of conversation about the right number, my concern has always been is that it is not fully in the department's hands how many children are placed in these facilities. It's in the court's hands. And if more than 18 are placed in a facility designed for 18 beds, if a court says, I'm placing that 19th child and we don't have a facility that can accept them, that child will wind up out of state. And so whatever cap we have to do it with the recognition that we need to build out those community-based services to make sure that there are alternatives for courts who are ultimately responsible for ordering placement of these children in a secure facility. With that said, there's a couple of points that I just want to address about this bill specifically, and I thought that Representative Edwards gave a really helpful overview of both the bill itself and then some suggested amendments on the House end. And so I thought it might be most productive if I could maybe just go through some of those and from the advocacy point of view, sort of give some thoughts on some of those some of that suggested language. So in going through Representative Edwards' proposal, and I will note that it appears that the proposal that's in front of the committees is slightly different than the amendment, and so I'm looking at the proposed language that is not in the formal amendment. And so in terms of the elimination of the surge capacity language, fully agree with that. That was not something that we preferred. We think that the surge capacity language is fraught and fully support the operational plan to support 12 to 14-year youth with some flexibility in how the space is used to have a bed capacity of 18. We are concerned about the language administered by the department as opposed to operated by the department. And the reason for that is that while Director Ribson described a situation where the advocates are completely aligned with, where it is operated by the facility with the ability to contract out for very specific services, like a psychiatrist, like a medical provider, like certain therapists. What we would not want to see is a facility that is operated by a private company. And the reason for that is few. First, if a private company is brought in to operate a facility and that private company is not living up to its obligations, it's not administering programming in a way that is safe for the youth in the facility, it is very challenging to address that. The department can issue corrective action plans, they can oversee that operation, but ultimately, it is not their staff that is operating the facility. And so they would have a couple of options. They could pull the contract and then replace it with what? Or they could, continue issuing the corrective action plans and do some more oversight. But what we see around the country is that private facilities often operate for very long periods of time in unsafe environments. And if this were a private facility that was not secure, it would be less concerning because children would be able to be moved from private facility to private facility. There's a few of them. But when we're talking about a single secure facility in a state with vulnerable youth who are our most vulnerable and shadowed youth that have the least access to the outside world, we need as much transparency and as much safety as possible. And while we recognize that there's been a sordid history of the facility, we think that the oversight by the Office of the Child Advocate in the last few years, changes that have been made by the department internally in the last few years, we can see the fruits of that, and we can see the improvements that the facility has made. And we believe that this is a facility that should continue to be not just administered by, but operated by the department with the ability, as they do now, to contract out for very specific services. The next piece that I wanted to address is so like going down on page 2, we absolutely agree that the facility should have the capability for alternative flexible use when the census permits. That makes sense. We're fine with the language adding to the that there should be a home-like interior to the maximum practical extent. That makes perfect sense. We are a bit concerned about the various places where the language encourages the use of virtualization of services. And that's not because we don't agree that virtualization of services can benefit many youth, because it can. It can benefit youth that come in with a therapeutic relationship, which unfortunately are very few of the kids that are in this facility. They are mostly kids that are disconnected and don't already have those therapeutic relationships. We also agree that children should be able to access, if they're going to be connected with a counselor on the outside, to begin that therapeutic relationship while in the facility, which may be virtual. We agree that when a child is receiving educational services, if they want to take a class that's not offered by the facility, they should have the ability to access that class on VLAX or some other program so that they can access either enrichment or classes that they're most interested in. But what we're concerned about with the statutory encouragement of virtualization of services is it seems to be pushing the department more towards a funding decision to decrease the costs rather than to provide services that are in the best interest of children. And when you have children who have been removed from society and have no connection with the outside world, save the few visits that they may or may not have with family who come to visit them, they are in need of connection, real connection for therapeutic services. These are the kids who develop connections with their staff, with their teachers, with their therapists, and many of them are not going to form those meaningful connections when they meet somebody for the very first time in a virtual environment. And so while we absolutely think there should be flexibility to use virtual services, and I believe the department does that already, we're very concerned about it being statutorily mandated in the way that that this language suggests. Going down to the second page, Roman 3D, we agree that because the census is increasing, that the 18-bed language is appropriate, and we agree with that. I think there was an oversight in this language. The Senate version said that there should be space with flexibility to meet the needs of all genders. The language was inadvertently changed to meet the needs of both genders. We believe that was an oversight, and just to be as inclusive as possible, we think that the language should remain all genders. The next few, so let's see, for the nutritional needs of youth, so this is section G. That makes perfect sense to us. The only question that we have about that is whether this means that that if a kitchen is in close proximity, that's good enough. Because if the kitchen that's in close proximity is in a private entity and it closes, what happens? That's very concerning. So we do think that there should be capacity to meet the nutritional needs of the youth on site in the event of some circumstances where food can't be catered in by whatever facility might be selected. So I don't know if that language should be tweaked or if that's good enough, but I think the intent should be clear that there needs to be a kitchen on site. We agree with subsection F. That makes sense. Again, subsection I, we have the same concerns about mandating and encouraging virtualization of services because we believe that's already permitted. So Roman 4, subsection A, we completely understand the intent of this. This is a secure facility. It needs to be a secure facility. The staff need to be safe. The students need to be safe. However, it's unclear to us whether or not the security personnel that this suggests bringing in are any security personnel or security personnel that are specifically trained to work with children. We do not believe that bringing in security that are strictly adult corrections minded is the appropriate way to go, because when that type of security is put into an environment that is addressing the needs of children, we think that that could create an unsafe situation and could lessen the therapeutic and rehabilitative goals of the facility. So to the extent that any language enhancing security is included, we think that it needs to be very clear that those security personnel are highly trained to work with children. So subsection E seems fine. Subsection F, we have the same virtual opportunity concerns. And then subsection I sort of goes back to that, the concern that we had about the security services. And then everything else looks fine. We're really expressing no opinion on Section 3 with its possession and disposal, nor are we expressing an opinion on whether or not we should continue to contract with other states. I'm happy to answer any questions that the committee may have.
Okay, thank you very much for your testimony. Are there any questions from the committee? Yes, Senator Chandler.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair. And, as I share both your appreciation for and your concerns regarding the language about virtualization, I'm just wondering, my first thought was simply to refer to it in terms of may seek virtual education or virtual counseling or whatever. Does that ease your concerns at all?
I think it might. I think the bigger concern, I think my biggest concerns are with the therapeutic services and the special education services. Because in those two circumstances, unless there's a prior connection, virtualization of services for basic therapy and special education services is almost never appropriate for the child. And so it would have to be accompanied with specific decisions that virtualization is both desired by and appropriate for the child.
Thank you.
Okay, any further questions? Senator Whitley.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for taking my question. Just want to direct your attention to sections 5, 6, and 7. There was some conversation, suggestions from both Representative Edwards and Representative Lynn about whether we need 5, 6, and 7, first of all, and then second of all, whether it's appropriate to be tied to the closure bill.
Yeah, so 5, 6, and 7 I was involved with last year, and the language went through a number of iterations. I think it started out very confusing. It got to a better place, but Representative Lynn did trigger me this morning that in this bill, that subsection J that he talked about is a problem. And so I was going to come in and testify that I don't think that that sections 5 through 7 are necessary to accompany these bills. To the extent they are, I think it's very important to get rid of the confusing language that is in, I think it's section 5. But given how politically fraught those sections were last year, and that the goal really needs to be to move a plan to the Sununu Center, to a new facility forward, I think dealing with those issues is better done separately. And quite frankly, I think dealing with the goal of sections 5 through 7, is better dealt with through enhancement of the system of care to reduce the size of the facility rather than shutting the door.
Okay, thank you. Are there any further questions? Seeing none, thank you.
Thank you.
I'm going to call the last speaker, Holly Stevens, to come forward. Good morning, Ms. Stevens.
Good morning, Chair Carson and members of the committee. I will be really quick this morning. My name is Holly Stevens. I'm the Director of Public Policy for NAMI New Hampshire. NAMI New Hampshire is a nonprofit grassroots organization whose mission is to improve the lives of people impacted by mental illness and suicide through support, education, and advocacy. And on behalf of NAMI New Hampshire, we are here today to urge you to support Senate Bill 1. We appreciate how quickly this bill was put together and that it's being heard as quickly as possible, because as we know, with the closure scheduled in March, something needs to be done so that these kids don't have to be sent out of state. And just really briefly, we know that many children enter the juvenile justice system as a result of unmet mental health needs, and the majority of the children in the juvenile justice system have a diagnosable mental health issue. And as far as this bill in particular, we do support having staff trained in trauma-informed care. We support that the treatment that is provided is evidence-based. And then just also specifically support the encouragement of frequent visits for family members with the youth that are in the center. And we also support the plan to implement this programming and the programming within the existing facility until such time as the new facility is built. So with that, we urge the committee to support Senate Bill 1, and I'll answer any questions that the committee may have.
Thank you very much for your testimony. Thank you very much for your testimony. Are there any questions from the committee? Seeing none, thank you.
Great, thank you very much.
We did get a late sign up, and that is Cassandra Sanchez.
Good morning, Madam Chair, and thank you for allowing me to speak. I apologize for the late sign up. My name is Cassandra Sanchez, and I'm the child advocate for the state. I am here in support of Senate Bill 1, but I would like to speak a bit on some of the concerns that I have with the amended language that was presented here today. And sharing similar views to Michelle Wangren, who spoke before me, I do share some concern for the use of telehealth. I do think language around it being an add-on service available to children would be a wonderful option to allow for that continuity of care that Senator Carson referred to. But I have concerns for that being utilized as the primary care for children in regards to their clinical support within the program. I did observe over a period of time there were some staffing issues with the clinical staff at the facility for a period, I believe, previous to my joining the office in April, but continuing through to August, where telehealth was an add-on for children so that they had access to clinical care. And in hearing from the children and their experiences, that was not effective for them, and that was not enough. They were asking for more, they needed more, and they were insightful enough to acknowledge that the telehealth option was not helping them treat their mental health needs. Unfortunately, we did see that some of those children ended up in Hampstead Hospital and needing a higher level of care. Ultimately, at this time, I do see adequate clinical staff on staff at the facility, and they're doing some great work with these kids to really work through their trauma and their current issues that brought them to the facility so that they can return to the community. But as Michelle had pointed out, it's the community supports that are necessary for the recidivism rates to drop for these children. We are seeing children return to the facility. So if this could be an add-on where they could have access to these providers before they leave, and these are providers that would follow them into the community, I do believe they would be much more successful and able to be maintained in the community long-term rather than returning to the facility. Also in regards to the behavior management or the security intervention at the facility, I do also agree with the need for this to be through the therapeutic approach. So currently, behavior management aligns with the treatment plans created by clinicians at the facility. And in the work that they are doing, they have worked very hard, and is also included in the Senate bill to continue to further enhance the therapeutic component, pulling back those layers of detention that have been in place at the facility and really allowing for the individualized care in all settings. So for their treatment plans to carry into the units and into the education classroom setting. So I'd like to see that behavior management continue to be left in the hands of the clinical team, and that if there is a physical management intervention needed, that is done with skilled professionals who have the background in mental health. Similar to what we see in residential facilities, everybody in residential facilities with the direct care staff are trained to use behavior management, but first de-escalation techniques, which are so important to reduce the hands-on restraints or leading to even possibly a need for seclusion if they really have an opportunity to intervene early on and the skill set to intervene early on and de-escalate these children.
I'm just going to interrupt you here for a second. I'm looking at Roman 4, and again, it's Representative Edwards' document. And it's talking about the facility program operations shall include staff qualifications, standard job descriptions, and training that emphasize the treatment of youth with behavioral health challenges. Do you feel that that sentence is adequate to address the concerns that you are bringing forward?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Follow up? I don't know if, do you have?
I don't have it in hand.
Okay.
I was taking notes as he was going through. Yes.
Senator, I read verbatim from the language.
I think may I follow up?
Sure.
Because I think what the Juvenile Reform Project, the language that they had some issues with is that sort of second part that Representative Edwards added, while providing self and group physical protection with the population. And I think I share the concern of the Office of Child Advocate that any quote unquote protection, which I think you're referring to as behavioral management, any physical contact should be done by clinical staff, not, correctional staff.
Correct. Yes, and I do agree now that I'm looking at it here, where you had ended, Senator Carson, with the behavioral health challenges. I do agree to that point. It is the concerning next line where while providing self and group physical protection.
Okay, and if I may continue, it goes on to saying, dealing with a population, I guess it says protection with a population having considerable trauma histories. So I think that language there encompasses what you are bringing forward. I do have a notation because of the language, the concern that Attorney Wangren brought up, and that maybe we need to put something in there that when you talk about the qualifications, that the qualifications would be specific, that would say something about people that are qualified to work with children rather than adults, meaning you could have someone who was trained how to physically restrain an adult, but not necessarily have the necessary training to have a child to restrain a child. I think there's a difference between the two. And so there was a consideration, and in my opinion, it was an ask that we look at that particular language to perhaps make it a qualification that they do have training and experience in working with children rather than adults.
Yes, and I do agree with that. Another important piece to add here is just ensuring that we continue to refer back to 126U, where it is utilizing the de-escalation attempts prior, because that is the concern where we see in more of that detention response, is that there are less attempts at de-escalation prior to getting to that physical intervention. Where it's a therapeutic approach, there are multiple attempts at de-escalation prior to having to go hands-on.
Okay, and if I may, I'm going to follow up. You did refer to isolation techniques. I don't know if you're aware that there is a piece of legislation coming forward that is going to deal with the use of isolation. So I don't believe we need to address it here because that will be in a separate piece of legislation.
Yes, thank you, Senator Carson. I am aware of that one.
Good.
I also wanted to touch on the concern noted before me around the family visitation. So family visitation, as we heard from Director Ribsum, a lot of the incidents that are leading children to this setting include domestic violence within the home. And so this speaks to the need for that family interaction to happen frequently, not only through the clinical setting, but also through visitation within the facility. So it's not something that we would like to make as an option. I believe it's something that is necessary for the success of this child for the children when they return to the community. So it should be ensured that they have access to regular visitation with family members.
Okay.
And lastly, in support of the bill, the language within Senate Bill 1 as presented in the original version, it does note in the continued real-time access to all reports for the Office of the Child Advocate. And I believe that that is extremely important to continue. Currently, if there are any incident reports that occur at the facility, we do receive them directly to our email and have the ability to review the full report and any incidents that led up to it and respond to the facility if we have any concerns. And I do believe that that protection and oversight is necessary to continue for the future of a facility.
Thank you very much. Are there any questions from the committee? Okay, seeing none, thank you.
Thank you all.
Seeing that that was all the individuals that we've had to sign up, I am going to go ahead and close the public hearing on Senate Bill 1. Thank you all for being here. Before we go anywhere, I want to see Senator Whitley, Senator Birdsall, Senator Bradley, Representative Edwards, and Representative Lynn. We're going to go upstairs into the Senate chamber, the Senate conference room upstairs. If you want.